was 13 the night my parents decided I was no longer their responsibility. They didn't say it like that, of course. People rarely admit to cruelty in clear words. Instead, they wrapped it in exhaustion, in frustration, in the kind of cold silence that makes you understand without needing explanation. My mother stood near the doorway with her arms folded, her eyes avoiding mine like I was something shameful she didn't want to acknowledge. My father didn't even look up from the table as he spoke, his voice flat, detached, like he was discussing a broken appliance instead of his daughter. He said I was difficult, that I brought problems into their lives, that they had done enough. I remember gripping the edge of my small backpack so tightly my fingers hurt, waiting for someone to laugh and say it was a joke, waiting for the moment to pass. It never did. Instead, my mother opened the door and stepped aside. That was the moment I realized I was truly alone. I stepped out into the dark street with nothing but a few clothes and the sound of the door closing behind me, louder than anything I had ever heard. For a long time, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was too shocked to process it. I walked without direction, my mind blank except for one thought repeating over and over. They didn't want me. The world felt enormous and hostile, every shadow stretching longer, every passing car making me flinch. Eventually, I found myself sitting on the cold steps of a closed shop, hugging my knees, trying to stay warm. That was my first night alone. I didn't sleep. I just waited for morning, hoping daylight would somehow make things less terrifying. It didn't. The days that followed blurred together. Hunger became a constant ache, something I learned to ignore because there was no other option. I knocked on doors, asked for help, got turned away more times than I could count. Some people looked at me with pity, others with suspicion, like I was lying, like a child couldn't possibly be abandoned without reason. Eventually, someone called social services. That should have been the moment things improved, but reality is rarely that simple. The system wasn't kind, just structured. I was placed in a temporary shelter, then moved again, and again. Each place felt temporary, each bed not truly mine. I learned quickly that attachment was dangerous, that people came and went, and that relying on anyone was a risk. At 14, I stopped expecting kindness. At 15, I stopped asking for it. I focused on survival instead. School became less about learning and more about stability, a place where I could sit indoors, where I could pretend to be normal for a few hours. I kept my head down, avoided attention, did what I had to do. But inside, something had changed. The part of me that once believed in family, in unconditional love, had been replaced by something colder, sharper. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was observing, learning, preparing. By 17, I had a part-time job and a plan. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was mine. I saved every bit of money I could, skipped meals when necessary, wore the same clothes longer than I should have. People at school thought I was quiet, maybe a little distant. They had no idea that every decision I made was calculated, that every step was part of a larger goal, never being powerless again. There were nights when the memories came back stronger than usual. The door closing, the silence, the feeling of being unwanted. Those memories didn't weaken me anymore. They fueled me. Every time I felt like giving up, I remembered that moment and pushed harder. I promised myself that one day I would stand in a place where no one could ever make me feel that small again. At 18, I aged out of the system. No more temporary shelters, no more assigned beds, just the real world, waiting without instructions. It was terrifying, but also freeing. For the first time, my life was entirely in my control. I rented a tiny room in a shared apartment, worked 2 jobs, and enrolled in night classes. Sleep became a luxury, something I sacrificed willingly. I wasn't chasing comfort. I was chasing security, independence, something solid enough that no one could take it away. Years passed like that, hard, relentless, but focused. I built myself piece by piece, slowly, carefully. Every achievement felt earned in a way most people would never understand. When I got my first real job, I didn't celebrate. I just moved on to the next goal. When I saved enough to move into my own apartment, I didn't decorate it much. I wasn't interested in appearances. I was interested in stability, control. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. I received a letter. Not an official document, not a bill, not anything I was used to. It had my name written in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost hesitant. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, a strange feeling settling in my chest. I didn't need to read it to know where it came from. Some things you just recognize. The handwriting, the tone, the weight of it. My past had found me again. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I placed it on the table and walked away, trying to ignore the way my thoughts began to spiral. After all these years, after everything, why now? What could they possibly want? The questions lingered, growing louder with each passing hour. Finally, I returned, picked up the letter, and unfolded it slowly. My hands were steady, but my mind wasn't. The first line was enough to confirm it. It was from them, my parents. The people who had once decided I wasn't worth keeping. The words were careful, almost rehearsed, filled with explanations and justifications that felt hollow even before I finished reading them. They talked about mistakes, about difficult times, about things I was apparently too young to understand back then. But beneath all of it, there was something else. Something they didn't say directly, but made clear in every line. They needed something. I folded the letter again, placing it back on the table exactly where it had been. For a moment, the room felt smaller, like the past had crept in and taken up space I had worked so hard to claim for myself. But then, something else happened. A realization. Quiet but powerful. I wasn't that 13-year-old girl anymore. I wasn't standing outside a closed door waiting to be let back in. This time, I was the one inside, and they were the ones outside. I left the letter where it was and didn't touch it again for the rest of the day, not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood something important in that moment. Control. For the first time, I didn't have to react immediately. I didn't have to explain myself, defend myself, or beg for anything. The urgency wasn't mine anymore. It was theirs. That shift settled quietly inside me, steadying something I didn't realize had still been fragile. The next morning, the letter was still on the table, exactly as I had left it. Sunlight slipped through the window, touching the edge of the paper, making it look almost harmless. I made coffee, sat down across from it, and read it again. This time slower, more carefully. The words didn't change, but my understanding of them did. They weren't just apologizing, they were positioning themselves. Every sentence was crafted to soften what they had done, to make it seem like something unfortunate rather than intentional. They used phrases like, "We had no choice," and "We thought it was for the best," as if abandoning a child could ever be framed as anything but a decision. Then I noticed something else. A line buried in the middle of the letter, almost easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. It mentioned financial difficulties, debts, legal trouble. The tone shifted there, becoming less reflective and more urgent. That was the real reason for the letter. Not regret, not guilt, need. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle. 15 years. 15 years without a word, without a single attempt to find me, to check if I was alive, if I had survived. And now, suddenly, they remembered I existed. Not because they cared, but because they needed something I had. The irony wasn't lost on me. For a moment, I considered throwing the letter away. It would have been easy, clean, final. But something stopped me. Not curiosity, not hope. Something else. A quiet, calculated instinct that had guided me through years of survival. This wasn't just about them reaching out. This was an opportunity. I folded the letter again, this time more deliberately, and placed it inside a drawer. Not hidden, just set aside. I needed time to think, not emotionally, but strategically. Because if they were in trouble, if they were desperate enough to reach out after all these years, then they were vulnerable. And vulnerability changes everything. The next few days, I went about my routine as usual. But my mind kept returning to that letter. Not in a painful way, but in a focused, analytical one. I thought about what they knew, what they didn't, and what they might assume. They didn't know who I had become. They didn't know what I had built. To them, I was probably still that 13-year-old girl, lost, dependent, easy to manipulate. That assumption was their first mistake. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I did something else. I started looking into their situation. It wasn't difficult. People leave trails, financial records, legal filings, small pieces of information scattered in places most don't think to look. It took time, patience, and attention to detail, but eventually the picture became clear. They weren't just struggling, they were close to losing everything. The house, their savings, even their reputation in the community had begun to crack under the pressure of unpaid debts and legal disputes. I sat in front of my laptop one evening, staring at the information I had gathered. Names, dates, amounts, everything neatly laid out. It felt strangely familiar. Documents had always been central to my life, even when I was younger. Papers decided where I stayed, what I received, what I was allowed to do. And now, once again, documents were shaping the situation. Only this time, I was the one reading them, understanding them, controlling what they meant. A small part of me wondered what would happen if I ignored them completely, if I let everything unfold without interference. They would lose their house, their stability, everything they had built after casting me out. It would be a kind of justice, simple and direct. But something about that felt incomplete, too easy. Because this wasn't just about consequences. It was about understanding, about making sure they truly saw what they had done, what it had led to. Letting them fall without facing that truth wouldn't change anything. It would just end the story quietly, without resolution. I closed the laptop and leaned back, thinking carefully. If I was going to respond, it wouldn't be emotional. It wouldn't be reactive. It would be controlled, deliberate, and precise. Just like everything else I had built in my life. 2 days later, I finally wrote back. The message was short. No warmth, no anger, no unnecessary words. I acknowledged their letter and asked a simple question. What exactly did they want from me? Then I sent it. The response came faster than I expected, within hours. That alone told me how desperate they were. This time, the message was longer, less composed. The careful tone from the letter was gone, replaced by something more urgent, almost pleading. They explained their situation in detail. Debts that had grown out of control, legal notices they couldn't ignore, deadlines that were closing in. They didn't directly ask for money at first, but it was clear where the conversation was heading. I read their message once, then again, paying attention not just to what they said, but how they said it. The shift in tone confirmed everything I had suspected. They weren't reaching out for reconciliation. They were reaching out for rescue. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let them wait. Hours turned into a day, then another. Each moment of silence on my end would increase the pressure on theirs. It wasn't about being cruel. It was about balance. For years, I had lived in uncertainty, waiting, hoping, adjusting to circumstances I couldn't control. Now they were the ones waiting. On the third day, I replied again. This time, I was more direct. I asked for specifics, numbers, documents, proof of everything they claimed. If they wanted anything from me, they would have to provide clarity. No vague explanations, no emotional appeals, just facts. Their response came even faster than before. Attachments this time, bank statements, legal notices, official documents outlining their situation. I opened each one carefully, reviewing them with the same focus I had developed over the years. Every detail mattered. Every number told part of the story. And as I went through them, one thing became clear. They needed me far more than I needed them. That realization didn't bring satisfaction the way I thought it might. Instead, it brought something else, a sense of quiet clarity. The roles had completely reversed. The power they once held over me was gone, replaced by something they couldn't control or predict. I closed the final document and sat in silence for a moment. Then I reached for a blank sheet of paper. Not my phone, not my laptop. This part required something different, something more deliberate. Because if I was going to open that door again, even slightly, it wouldn't be for their sake. It would be for mine. I stared at the blank sheet of paper for a long time before writing anything. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood that whatever I wrote next would define everything that followed. This wasn't just a response, it was a decision. A line I would either draw or erase. When I finally picked up the pen, I didn't rush. Every word mattered. I started by acknowledging the documents they had sent, confirming that I had reviewed them. Then I wrote something they probably didn't expect. I told them I was willing to meet, but only under specific conditions. Neutral location, no emotional discussions, no attempts to rewrite the past. This would be about facts, not feelings. I read the letter twice before folding it. It was calm, controlled, and clear. There was no anger in it, no trace of the 13-year-old girl they had left behind. Just someone who understood the situation better than they did. I sent it and waited. Their reply came the next day. Short, agreeable, almost too quick. They accepted every condition without question. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They weren't in a position to negotiate. We set the meeting for the end of the week. A small office space I occasionally used for work, private, quiet, and, most importantly, mine. I didn't want to step into their environment or give them any sense of familiarity or control. If this conversation was going to happen, it would happen on my terms. The days leading up to the meeting were surprisingly calm. I expected tension, maybe even doubt, but instead, there was a steady sense of focus. I prepared the same way I approached everything else in my life, with structure and intention. I reviewed their documents again, organized my notes, and outlined the key points I wanted to address. Not because I needed help understanding the situation, but because I wanted to control the flow of the conversation. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early. The room was simple. A table, 3 chairs, a window that let in just enough light to keep everything visible but not exposed. I placed a folder on the table, neatly arranged, and sat down. For a moment, I allowed myself to notice the silence. It wasn't the same silence I remembered from years ago. This one felt different, controlled, chosen. They arrived 10 minutes later. I heard their footsteps in the hallway before the door opened. For a brief second, something tightened in my chest. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition, maybe. But it passed quickly. When they stepped inside, they hesitated. That was the first thing I noticed. Not their faces, not their expressions, but that slight pause at the doorway, like they weren't sure they were allowed to enter. It was a small detail, but it said everything. My mother looked older, her posture slightly bent, her confidence worn down in a way I hadn't expected. My father avoided eye contact at first, scanning the room instead, as if trying to understand the space before acknowledging me. I didn't stand. I didn't move. I simply gestured to the chairs across from me. Sit. My voice was calm, neutral. Not cold, not warm, just controlled. They sat down without arguing. Another sign of how much things had changed. Years ago, they would have expected obedience from me. Now they followed my lead without question. For a moment, no one spoke. They looked at me, searching for something. Recognition, maybe, or a trace of the girl they once knew. They wouldn't find it. My mother was the first to break the silence. She started with my name, softly, like it might bridge the gap between us. It didn't. We're glad you agreed to meet, she said. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without responding to it. Then I opened the folder in front of me and slid a few documents across the table. I reviewed everything you sent, I said. These are your current liabilities. They both looked down at the papers, their expressions tightening as they recognized the numbers laid out clearly in front of them. I had simplified everything. Debts, deadlines, legal consequences. No confusion, no room for interpretation. My father cleared his throat. Yes, it's been difficult. We didn't expect things to. I raised my hand slightly, stopping him. This isn't about what you expected, I said. It's about what is. He fell silent immediately. I leaned back in my chair, watching them carefully. Every reaction, every glance, every hesitation, it all mattered. This wasn't just a conversation. It was an evaluation. You're facing legal action within 30 days, I continued. If those debts aren't addressed, you lose the house. Possibly more. My mother nodded quickly. her hands clasped together tightly. "We know. That's why we reached out. We didn't know where else to go." There it was. Not an apology, not regret. Just need. I let a few seconds pass before responding. Silence can be more effective than words when used correctly. It gives people space to reveal more than they intend. "And why," I asked finally, "did you think I would help you?" The question hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said so far. They exchanged a quick glance before my father answered. "Because we're family." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. "Family," I repeated, as if testing the word. That's interesting. I closed the folder slowly, placing my hands on top of it. 15 years ago, you decided I wasn't part of that family anymore, I said. So I'm curious. What changed? Neither of them answered immediately. My mother looked down at her hands, while my father shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "We made a mistake," she said eventually, her voice quieter now. "We were under pressure, and we didn't handle it the way we should have." "A mistake," I repeated. "That's what you call it?" I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to. The calmness made the words sharper. "You didn't forget to pick me up from school," I continued. "You didn't misplace something important. You made a decision. You opened a door and let your 13-year-old daughter walk out of it alone." The room fell silent again. This time, it felt heavier. My father finally looked at me directly. "We thought you'd be taken care of. We assumed. You assumed someone else would fix what you chose to break," I said, cutting him off again. He didn't argue. I let the silence settle once more before speaking again, this time more slowly. "You're asking for help," I said. "Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. Help." My mother nodded, her eyes slightly red now. "We just need a chance to fix things. To recover." I studied her for a moment, then shifted my attention back to both of them. "I can help you," I said. Both of them looked up immediately, relief flashing across their faces so quickly it was almost instinctive. But I wasn't finished. "There are conditions," I added. The relief didn't disappear, but it changed, mixed now with uncertainty. "What kind of conditions?" my father asked carefully. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table. "The kind you don't get to negotiate," I said. My words settled into the room with a quiet finality that neither of them challenged. They didn't interrupt, didn't question the tone. That alone told me they understood their position. For once, they weren't the ones setting expectations. I opened the folder again and pulled out a single document, placing it between us but keeping my hand on it. Not offering it yet, just letting it exist in their view. "This," I said calmly, "is a structured agreement." They both leaned forward slightly, their attention fixed on the paper. "It outlines exactly what I'm willing to do and what I'm not," I continued. "If I step in, your debts get handled. The legal action stops. You keep your house." My mother's breath caught slightly at that, and my father's shoulders shifted as if some invisible weight had already begun to lift. "But," I added, pressing my fingers lightly against the document, "that outcome comes with terms." My father nodded quickly. "Of course. Whatever you need, we can—" I looked at him, and he stopped speaking immediately. "You don't get to offer," I said. "You get to listen." Silence returned. I slid the document across the table this time. Slowly. Deliberately. They both reached for it, reading side by side. I watched their expressions instead of the paper. That told me far more than the words ever could. At first, there was relief. then concentration, then confusion, and finally, something closer to disbelief. My mother was the first to react. This says the house would be transferred. Yes, I replied. She looked up at me, her brows drawn together. To you? Yes. The word was simple, uncomplicated. My father's jaw tightened slightly. You want ownership of the house. I want control of the asset that's at risk, I corrected. If I'm the one resolving your debts, I'm the one securing the outcome. He leaned back in his chair, processing that. So we just sign everything over? No, I said calmly. You retain the right to live there. That doesn't change. But ownership shifts. Legally. Permanently. The word permanently lingered. I let it. My mother's hands tightened around the edge of the paper. That's a big decision. I didn't respond immediately. I let the weight of that statement sit in the room for a moment before answering. So was the one you made 15 years ago, I said. Her eyes dropped again. I continued before either of them could speak. There are additional conditions, I said, tapping lightly on the document. Financial transparency moving forward. No independent loans. No undisclosed liabilities. And one more thing. They both looked up again, more cautious now. No contact outside of agreed terms, I said. This is not a return to a relationship. This is an agreement. Structured. Limited. Clear. My father frowned slightly. You don't want anything else? I held his gaze. No. That seemed to unsettle him more than anything else I had said so far. People expect anger. They expect demands shaped by emotion. They understand conflict, but this absence of it, was harder to process. My mother spoke again, more quietly this time. You don't even want to try to fix things? I considered the question for a moment. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to choose the exact words. Some things aren't fixed, I said finally. They're understood. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Less tense. More defined. My father looked back down at the document, reading it again, slower this time. And if we don't agree? I leaned back in my chair. Then nothing changes, I said. Your situation continues exactly as it is. Deadlines pass, consequences follow. No pressure in my tone, just clarity. They exchanged another glance, longer this time. A silent conversation happening between them, one I didn't need to hear to understand. After a moment, my mother spoke again. We need time to think. I nodded once. You have 3 days. 3 days? My father repeated, surprised. Yes, I said. Your legal deadline is in 30. Every day you wait reduces your options. I've already accounted for that in this timeline. He didn't argue. I gathered the rest of the documents into the folder, leaving the agreement in front of them. You can take that with you, I said. Review it. Ask questions if you need to. But understand this. I paused just long enough to make sure they were fully focused. This is the only version of help I'm offering. My mother nodded slowly, folding the document carefully, almost as if it were fragile. We understand, she said. I stood then, signaling the end of the meeting. They followed a second later, a bit slower, as if still adjusting to the shift in control. At the door, my father hesitated. He turned back slightly, like he wanted to say something else. Maybe an apology. Maybe an explanation. I didn't give him the chance. This is a decision, I said before he could speak. Not a conversation. He nodded once, then opened the door and stepped out. My mother followed, holding the document close to her chest. When the door closed behind them, the room returned to silence. I stood there for a moment, not moving, not thinking, just aware of the stillness. Then I walked back to the table, gathered the remaining papers, and placed them neatly into the folder. Everything exactly where it belonged. There was no rush, no lingering emotion, just a quiet sense of completion for this part of the process. They had come to my door asking for help. Now they had a choice to make, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. The next 3 days passed with a quiet precision that almost felt rehearsed. I didn't check my phone more than usual. I didn't revisit the meeting in my mind. I simply moved forward with my routine, knowing that the silence on their end wasn't empty. It was pressure building. Every hour that passed was a reminder of their situation tightening around them. On the second day, I received a message. Not a decision, just a question. My father asked if there was any flexibility in the agreement. The wording was careful, almost cautious, as if he already knew the answer but hoped for something different. I read it once and set the phone down. I didn't respond immediately. Timing mattered. After a few hours, I replied with a single sentence. No. Nothing else. No explanation, no justification. Just clarity. There was no response after that. By the third day, the silence returned, heavier now, more deliberate. I knew what that meant. They were deciding whether they could accept the terms, or whether their pride would cost them everything. That evening, just as the day was ending, my phone rang. I looked at the screen for a moment before answering. Yes, I said calmly. My father's voice came through, quieter than I remembered. We've reviewed everything. I didn't speak. I let him continue. We will agree to your terms. There was a slight pause before he added, all of them. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Then we moved forward. My mother's voice came next, softer, almost hesitant. What happens now? Now, I said, we formalize it. The process moved quickly after that. Documents were prepared, reviewed, and signed under proper legal supervision. I handled everything with the same efficiency I applied to every other part of my life. There were no delays, no confusion, no room for mistakes. Every detail was accounted for. The day they signed the agreement, I watched carefully, not because I doubted the outcome, but because I wanted to see it. The moment of realization, the point where everything became irreversible. My father signed first, his movements steady but slower than usual. My mother followed, her hand pausing briefly before completing her signature. That hesitation was the only visible sign of what the decision meant. When it was done, the documents were collected, verified, and finalized. Just like that, the house was no longer theirs. The debts were addressed immediately after. Payments arranged, legal actions halted, deadlines neutralized. The situation that had been closing in on them for months began to dissolve within days. From the outside, it probably looked like everything had been resolved. Clean, efficient, almost simple. But it wasn't simple. Because while their problem had been solved, something else had shifted. Something they couldn't reverse or renegotiate. The next time I visited the house, it felt different. Not because the structure had changed, but because the meaning had. The same walls, the same rooms, the same details, but none of it belonged to them anymore. My mother opened the door when I arrived. She stepped aside immediately, letting me in without a word. The gesture was small, but it carried weight. I walked inside slowly, taking in the space. It wasn't unfamiliar, but it didn't feel like home either. It felt like a place I understood, but didn't belong to. My father was in the living room, standing as I entered. He nodded once in acknowledgement. Everything's been processed, I said, placing a folder on the table. The legal confirmations are inside. He stepped forward, picking it up carefully. Thank you. I didn't respond to that. Gratitude wasn't part of this arrangement. Instead, I moved further into the room, my attention shifting to the small details: the furniture, the placement of objects, the subtle signs of how they had lived here all these years. My mother spoke after a moment. "Would you like some tea?" I looked at her briefly. "No." She nodded and stepped back, unsure of what to do next. That uncertainty filled the room quietly. They didn't know how to act around me anymore. The roles they had once held didn't exist now, and they hadn't figured out what replaced them. I turned back toward them, keeping my tone even. "There are a few things we need to clarify," I said. "Going forward." They both focused immediately. "The agreement outlines your right to remain here," I continued. "That doesn't change. But there are expectations tied to that." My father nodded. "We understand." "Good," I said, "because this only works if everything stays within those terms." There was no resistance, no argument, just quiet acceptance. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother said something unexpected. "You've done well for yourself." It wasn't said with pride. It wasn't said with regret either. Just an observation, simple and direct. I met her gaze briefly. "Yes?" She nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Less tense, more defined. I checked the time, then stepped back toward the door. "That's all for now." My father looked like he wanted to say something again, but he stopped himself. This time, I didn't need to interrupt. He already understood. As I reached the door, my mother spoke once more. "Will you come back?" I paused, my hand resting lightly on the handle. Not because the question was difficult, but because the answer needed to be clear. "When necessary," I said. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just steady. I walked to my car without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that I needed to return to. Days turned into weeks, and the arrangement settled into something quiet and structured. There were no unexpected calls, no emotional messages, no attempts to blur the boundaries that had been clearly set. Everything operated within the agreement, controlled, predictable, contained. I didn't visit often. There was no reason to. The house was stable, the finances were managed, and the situation no longer required constant attention. From a distance, everything functioned exactly as intended. But control doesn't eliminate observation. Every so often, I would review the updates, financial summaries, maintenance reports, small details that ensured nothing drifted outside the structure I had put in place. It wasn't about distrust. It was about consistency. Then one evening, something shifted. It started with a small irregularity, a transaction that didn't align with the pattern I had established. Not large enough to cause immediate concern, but noticeable. Out of place. I didn't react right away. Instead, I looked deeper. Cross-referenced dates, amounts, sources. One inconsistency rarely exists alone, and it didn't take long before I found another, then another. A pattern was forming. I sat back, studying the information in silence. The deviations were subtle, spaced out, almost careful, but they were there, and they pointed to one thing: an attempt to operate outside the agreement. I closed the file and let a few minutes pass, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. Reacting too quickly can blur judgment. Waiting clarifies it. The next morning, I sent a message. "Be available this afternoon." No explanation, no accusation, just instruction. The response came quickly. Of course. When I arrived at the house, everything looked the same. Nothing on the surface suggested anything had changed. But surface appearances had never meant much. My father opened the door this time. His expression was neutral, but there was something underneath it, something tighter, less certain. "We weren't expecting you today," he said. "I didn't ask for availability based on expectations," I replied, stepping inside. He moved aside immediately. My mother was in the living room. She stood as I entered, her posture slightly tense. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to understand why I was there. I didn't sit. I didn't ease into the conversation. Instead, I placed a thin folder on the table and opened it. "Explain this," I said. They both looked down. The pages were simple. Dates, amounts, highlighted entries. Nothing complicated. Just facts arranged in a way that couldn't be misinterpreted. My father was the first to speak.
"It's not what it looks like."
That response was immediate, instinctive. I didn't react to the words. I reacted to the timing. "Then clarify it," I said. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough.
"It was temporary,"
he added quickly.
"We intended to—"
"Temporary isn't part of the agreement," I interrupted. My voice wasn't louder. It didn't need to be. My mother stepped forward slightly. "We thought it wouldn't matter. It was a small amount, and we were going to fix it before I noticed?" I asked. Silence. That silence answered more than anything they could have said. I closed the folder slowly. "The agreement was clear," I said. "No independent financial actions, no undisclosed decisions. Everything goes through the structure." My father nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement.
"We understand that now,"
he said. "No," I replied. "You understood it before. You chose to ignore it." The distinction mattered. My mother's voice softened. "It won't happen again." I looked at her for a moment, then shifted my attention back to both of them. "That's not the point," I said. I let the words settle before continuing. "The point is that you tested the boundary." Neither of them argued. "And when boundaries are tested," I added, "they're either reinforced or they lose meaning." The room felt tighter now, the air heavier.
Not chaotic, just controlled pressure. My father took a breath.
"What happens now?"
I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the window, looking out briefly before turning back. Not for effect, but to give the moment space. "What happens now," I said, "depends on whether this was a mistake or a pattern."
"It was a mistake,"
my mother said quickly. I studied her expression. The tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were held close together. Fear, not deception. But fear doesn't erase decisions. "Then we treat it as one," I said. Relief flickered across both of their faces, but I didn't let it settle. "With consequences," I added. The relief shifted into uncertainty again. I stepped back toward the table, placing my hand lightly on the folder. "From this point forward, all financial activity will require pre-approval," I said. "No exceptions, not even small amounts." My father nodded.
"That's fair."
And, I continued, there will be a full review every 2 weeks instead of monthly.
He nodded again, slower this time.
"Understood."
My mother didn't speak, but her expression showed she was processing the shift. "This isn't punishment," I said. "It's correction." I paused briefly. "And if it happens again," I added, "the terms change." That part didn't need explanation. They understood. The room settled into silence once more. But this time it felt different. Not uncertain. Defined. Reinforced. I closed the folder and picked it up. "Stay within the agreement," I said. "That's all that's required." They both nodded. I turned toward the door, the conversation already complete in my mind. As I reached it, my father spoke.
"We didn't mean to—"
I stopped. But I didn't turn around. Meaning doesn't change outcomes, I said. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was still, unchanged, steady. Behind me, the structure remained intact, but stronger now, not weaker. Because boundaries, once tested and reinforced, don't just hold. They define everything that comes after. After that visit, everything became quieter, but not in a comfortable way. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something has been exposed. Not broken, not yet, but revealed. They followed the rules more carefully after that. Every transaction was documented. Every decision was cleared. The reports became cleaner, more precise. On paper, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. But something had changed beneath that surface. Trust hadn't been rebuilt. It had been replaced. What existed now wasn't belief in their actions, but control over them. And control, while effective, doesn't create connection. It creates distance. I noticed it in the way they communicated. Shorter messages, more formal tone, no unnecessary words. It was as if they had finally understood the nature of the relationship. Not personal, not emotional. Functional. And that was fine. That was the design. Months passed like that. Stable. Predictable. Almost routine. Then one evening, another message came. This one was different. It wasn't about finances. It wasn't about the house. It was from my mother. Can we speak? Just that. No details, no context. I stared at the message for a moment before replying. When? Her response came a few minutes later. Whenever you're available. I considered it briefly, then sent back a time for the next day. Not at the house, a neutral place again. The same office space as before. When she arrived, she was alone. That was the first difference. She stepped inside slowly, her movements more cautious than before. Not hesitant, just aware. Sit, I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. She did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. But this silence wasn't the same as before. It wasn't structured or controlled. It felt uncertain. She was the one who broke it. I wanted to talk without him here, she said. I didn't respond. I let her continue. There are things I didn't say before. Her hands were resting in her lap, fingers slightly tense, like she was holding something back, not physically, but emotionally. This isn't about the agreement, she added quickly. Everything there is fine. We're following it. I know, I said. She nodded, as if that confirmed something she needed to hear. Then she took a breath, a deeper one this time. I've been thinking about that night, she said. The night you left. The words landed differently than I expected, not because of what they meant, but because of how directly she said them. No avoidance, no softened language. I didn't interrupt. We told ourselves a lot of things back then, she continued. That it was temporary, that someone would help you, that it wasn't as bad as it looked. She paused briefly, her gaze dropping for a moment before returning to me. But none of that was true, she said. The honesty was unexpected. Not dramatic, not emotional, just clear. We knew what we were doing, she added. We just didn't want to say it out loud. I watched her carefully, not for signs of manipulation, but for consistency. Tone, posture, timing, everything aligned. And now? I asked. The question was simple, but it mattered. She didn't answer immediately. She took another breath, slower this time. Now I know exactly what we did, she said, and I know there's nothing I can say that changes it. Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy. It was settled. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, that was clear. She wasn't trying to justify anything either. She was stating something. For herself, not for me. I didn't come here to ask for anything, she said after a moment. Not help, not understanding. I nodded slightly. Then why did you come? She looked at me directly, her expression steady in a way it hadn't been before. Because you deserved to hear the truth without conditions, she said. The words were simple, but they didn't feel rehearsed. I considered that for a moment. Not emotionally, just objectively. Truth doesn't change outcomes, I said. I know, she replied. Another pause. But it changes what comes after, she added quietly. That was the first statement that didn't fit neatly into logic.
It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't something that could be measured or structured either. I leaned back slightly, studying her again.
What do you think comes after? I asked. She didn't answer right away. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe nothing. Maybe just this. This, I repeated. She nodded. A situation where everything is clear, she said, even if it's not fixed. The distinction was familiar. I let a few seconds pass before responding. It's already clear, I said. Yes, she agreed, but it wasn't said before. That was true. For years, everything had been defined by actions, not words, decisions made without explanation, outcomes without acknowledgement. This was different. Not a correction, not a repair, just acknowledgement. I stood then, not abruptly, but with intention. That's all? I asked. She nodded. That's all. No expectation. No follow-up. I walked her to the door, stopping just before opening it. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Then she spoke again, softer this time. You built something strong, she said. I see that now. I didn't respond to the statement. Not because I disagreed, but because it didn't require an answer. I opened the door. She stepped out, pausing just slightly before turning away. And then she was gone. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, not thinking, not analyzing, just aware. Nothing had changed. The agreement was still in place. The structure still held. The boundaries remained exactly where they were. But something had shifted. Not in them, not in the situation. In the space between what had happened and what was left of it. After that conversation, nothing outwardly changed, and yet, something had settled into place that hadn't been there before. Not resolution, not closure in the way people describe it. Just a clearer understanding of where everything stood, without distortion. The structure remained the same. Reports came in on schedule,
every detail aligned with the agreement. No more deviations, no more quiet attempts to test boundaries. It was as if that single conversation had removed whatever uncertainty remained. Not about the rules, but about the consequences of ignoring them. Weeks turned into months again, and the routine continued. I stayed focused on my own life, the one I had built without them. Work expanded, responsibilities grew, and with it came a level of stability that didn't feel fragile anymore. It wasn't something I had to protect constantly. It simply existed, steady and consistent. Then, one afternoon, I received another update. This one wasn't unusual in content. Financial summaries, maintenance confirmations, everything in order. But at the end of the report, there was a small note. Not part of the formal structure, just a single line. Property taxes are due next month. Everything is prepared. It was routine, normal, exactly the kind of detail I expected to see, but something about it held my attention longer than it should have, because it wasn't just information, it was awareness. They weren't just following instructions anymore, they were anticipating them. I closed the file and sat back, thinking about that shift. It was subtle, but meaningful. The system I had put in place wasn't just controlling their actions, it was reshaping them. Not completely, not fundamentally, but enough to change how they approached things. Control had turned into discipline, and discipline over time becomes habit. A few days later, I visited the house again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to observe the difference directly. My father opened the door, as he usually did now. There was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty in the way he stepped aside to let me in. Everything inside looked the same, clean, organized, maintained, but the atmosphere felt different, less tense. Not relaxed, but stable. My mother was in the kitchen. She glanced up as I entered, then gave a small nod before returning to what she was doing. No forced conversation, no unnecessary gestures. It was functional. I walked through the space slowly, taking in the details, noticing what had changed and what hadn't. Then I stopped in the living room. There, on the table, was something new. A folder. Not one I had placed there. I turned slightly. "What's this?" My father followed my gaze. "Something we wanted to show you." I didn't move immediately. I just looked at it for a moment before stepping closer and opening it. Inside were documents, organized, labeled. But these weren't financial reports. They were records. Old ones. School documents, medical files, notes, things that dated back years. My name appeared across multiple pages. I looked up. Where did these come from? My mother stepped forward slightly. "We kept them." The answer was simple. I looked back down at the folder, flipping through a few more pages. Dates I barely remembered, details from a time that felt distant, almost disconnected. "Why show me this now?" I asked. They exchanged a brief glance before my father answered.
Because they're yours,
He said. I paused.
they always were.
He added. The statement was straightforward, no hidden meaning, no condition attached. I closed the folder slowly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Why didn't you give them to me before? The silence that followed was different from the others. Not tense, not uncertain, just honest. My mother answered this time. Because before, we weren't thinking about what was yours, she said. I held her gaze for a second longer than usual. And now? Now we are, she replied. There was no apology in her voice, no attempt to soften the statement, just a clear acknowledgement of what had changed. I looked back down at the folder, then closed it completely. I'll take it, I said. My father nodded once.
Of course.
I picked it up, holding it briefly before turning toward the door. No further discussion was needed. As I stepped outside, the weight of the folder felt different. Not heavy, not light, just present. These were pieces of a past I had moved beyond. Records of a life that had been interrupted, redirected, rebuilt. But now they were back in my hands. Not because I needed them, but because, for the first time, they had been returned without condition. I placed the folder in my car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Through the windshield, the house stood exactly as it always had. But the meaning of it had changed again. It wasn't just a place tied to what had been taken, or even what had been regained. It had become something else entirely. A structure defined not by ownership, but by what people chose to do after everything was already decided. I didn't open the folder right away. It stayed in my car for the rest of the day, then on my desk that night, untouched. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood something about timing. Some things don't need to be rushed, especially not pieces of a past that no longer control you. The next morning, I finally opened it. The pages inside were exactly what they appeared to be. School reports, medical notes, old evaluations. Small records of a life that had once been structured around decisions I didn't make. I flipped through them slowly, not searching for anything specific, just observing. There were comments from teachers, descriptions of a quiet student, independent, reserved, adapts quickly. Words that seemed neutral on the surface, but carried more meaning now than they did back then. There were medical notes, routine checkups, minor details, nothing significant. But even those carried a strange weight.
Proof that there had been a time when someone was responsible for tracking my well-being. And then there were handwritten notes. Not official, not structured, just small pieces of writing, reminders, observations, fragments of something more personal. I paused on one of them. It was brief, a single sentence. She doesn't ask for help anymore. No date, no name attached, just that line. I stared at it for a long moment before closing the folder, not because it affected me emotionally, but because it confirmed something I had already known. The shift hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, observed, not prevented. I placed the folder aside and continued with my day. But that sentence stayed with me, not as something unresolved, but as something complete, because it explained more than anything else ever had. Days passed, then weeks. The structure held. The routine continued. And then, one evening, something unexpected happened. A knock at my door. Not a message, not a scheduled visit. A knock. I stood still for a moment, not surprised, but aware. When I opened the door, they were both there. My parents, standing outside. For the first time since that night 15 years ago, the positions were fully reversed. They weren't calling. They weren't requesting a meeting on neutral ground. They were at my door. And they were waiting. I didn't speak immediately. I just looked at them, taking in the details, the posture, the quiet tension in the way they stood. My father was the one who spoke first. "We didn't schedule this," he said. "I can see that," I replied. There was no irritation in my voice, just observation. "We know," my mother added quickly. We needed to come." I didn't move aside. "Why?" I asked. They exchanged a glance. Then my father answered, "Because this time, it wasn't about the agreement." I held his gaze, waiting. "It wasn't about the house, or the structure, or anything you've put in place," he continued. "It was about something we should have done a long time ago." Silence followed. Not heavy, just direct. My mother stepped forward slightly, but not enough to cross the threshold.
"We didn't come to ask for anything," she said. "Not help, not understanding, not even time." I noticed the wording. Careful, clear. "Then what did you come for?" I asked. She took a breath, then answered, "To stand where you once stood." The sentence landed quietly, but it didn't need force to carry weight. I didn't respond right away, because I understood exactly what she meant. Standing outside, waiting, without control, without certainty. For a moment, no one moved. Then I stepped back, not fully, just enough to open the space. 5 minutes, I said. They didn't hesitate. They stepped inside, carefully, respectfully, like they understood this wasn't entry, it was permission. The room was quiet as they stood there, taking in the space. My space. No one spoke immediately. Then my father did something unexpected. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He just said, "We were wrong." Simple, direct, no added context, no softened language, just that. My mother nodded slightly, her voice quieter when she spoke. "We chose ourselves over you," she said, "and we knew it." Again, no excuses, no attempt to reshape the past, just clarity. I watched them for a moment, then spoke. "Yes," I said. Not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was complete. There was nothing else to explain, nothing left to uncover. After a moment, I stepped back toward the door. "That's 5 minutes," I said. They understood. They didn't argue, didn't ask for more time. They turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, my mother paused slightly. Not to speak, not to ask. Just to look. Then she stepped outside.
My father followed. And just like that, they were on the other side again. I closed the door, the same way it had been closed 15 years ago. But this time, it wasn't forced. It wasn't final in the same way. It was chosen. I stood there for a moment, then turned back into the room. Nothing had changed. The structure was still intact. The boundaries still held. But something had reached its end. Not the relationship, because that had already been defined. Not the past, because that couldn't be changed. But the weight of it. The part that lingers without resolution. That was gone. Because in the end, they did come back. Not with power, not with control, but with the one thing they never had before. Understanding. And this time, I was the one who decided what to do with it. I stood in the quiet room long after the door closed. Not because I was unsure, but because I was noticing something subtle. The absence of tension I had lived with for years without even naming it. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction either. It was more like a system finally completing a cycle it had been running in the background for too long. I walked back to the center of the room and sat down. For a while, I didn't touch anything. No phone, no documents, no updates. Just stillness. My mind didn't replay the conversation the way people assume it would in moments like this. There was no emotional rewind, no dramatic reflection. Instead, I found myself observing it like a finished case file. Facts were now complete. Their words had been clear. Their intent had been unguarded. And for the first time, there had been no negotiation layered underneath. No strategy. No hidden agenda. Just acknowledgement. That alone made it different from everything that had come before. But acknowledgement doesn't erase structure. And structure is what I had built my life around. I stood again and walked to the window. Outside, the street looked ordinary. People moving through their own routines, unaware of anything significant having shifted in a small office space nearby. That was always the strange part of moments like this, how internally final they felt, while externally nothing changed at all. My phone buzzed once on the table, a notification. I didn't pick it up immediately. I already knew what it would be. When I finally checked it, it was a message from my father. "Thank you for letting us come." Short. Respectful. No continuation. I read it once, then placed the phone back down. There was nothing to respond to. Not because it was meaningless, but because it was complete. A few hours later, I drove back to the house. Not out of obligation, not out of curiosity. Just to close the loop on something that had shifted earlier. When I arrived, I didn't go inside right away. I stayed in the car for a moment, looking at the structure in front of me. It no longer represented what it once had. It wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It wasn't even a symbol of control. It was just a place where something had started and ended in a different form than it began. I stepped out and walked to the door. My mother opened it before I could knock. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stepped aside, as if that had become instinct now. Inside, everything was the same, but quieter. My father was sitting in the living room. When he saw me, he stood briefly, then sat again. Not out of formality, just awareness. "I didn't come to revisit anything," I said. They both nodded. "I know," my father replied. I walked a few steps into the room, then stopped. "There's nothing left to resolve," I continued. "Everything has already been resolved." My mother lowered her gaze slightly, then nodded. "Yes," she said softly. That single word carried more acceptance than anything else I had heard from them before. Not agreement, not justification. Acceptance. I turned slightly, looking around the room once more. Not analyzing, just observing. "You can continue as agreed," I said. "Nothing changes." My father exhaled slowly, almost like he had been holding something in for a long time. "We will," he said. There was no hesitation now, no uncertainty layered underneath the response.
I stepped back toward the door. Before I reached it, my mother spoke again.
"Do you ever think about it?" she asked.
I stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. There was no need to ask what it meant. I considered the question for a moment, not emotionally, but precisely. "Yes," I said finally.
A pause.
"Not the way you think," I added. I turned then, briefly. "Not as something unresolved," I continued. "As something that happened." Her expression didn't change much, but something softened in it anyway. Not relief, not sadness. Just understanding. I opened the door. This time, no one followed. No one spoke. As I stepped outside, the air felt unchanged. The world continued exactly as it had before. But internally, the structure that had defined so much of my life had finally shifted into something stable enough that it no longer needed active control. Not fixed, not healed, just complete in its own way. I walked back to my car and paused before getting in. For a moment, I looked back at the house once more. There was no closure waiting there anymore. No final answer hidden behind another conversation. No last explanation waiting to be spoken. Just continuity and understanding that some things don't end with resolution. They end with clarity. I got into the car and started the engine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was moving away from anything. I was simply moving forward.